When addressing the major problems with modern America, it seems difficult for me to not start with the family. Sure, there are issues with education, labor, politics, but all these problems have been seen throughout history and can be seen in many places in the modern world. America, however, has a problem not seen often in other countries, or at least not to the same extent. According to multiple studies done by Pew Research Center, the US has the highest rate in the world of children living in single-parent homes. The numbers across various studies give a good estimate of about 25%. That's 1 in 4 American children living in a home without one of their parents. But that doesn't tell the whole story. As of 2017, about 65% of children are living with married parents, down from 85% in 1968. Of the 35% that are not living in a married parent household, 21% are living with a single mother, 4% with a single father, 7% cohabiting unmarried parents, and 3% neither. Meaning, as of 2017, 3% don't have a parent, 25% of children are living with only one parent, and 35% are living in a home situation without married parents. Historically speaking, this issue in America has been viewed as a common problem in the Black community and an anomaly or lesser concern among other ethnic groups. And while that used to be true, that is not at all the case today. Black households are still the most likely, but all races have alarmingly high rates of single motherhood. This graph charts what the percentage of births are to unmarried mothers across ethnic homes since the 1950s. You can see that around 1960 is when the rates started increasing, and at 1970, both the rate of change and the total percent of unmarried mothers grow dramatically. The ratio has been relatively stable since the late 2000s, with Black households at 70%, Latino households at 55%, and white households at 35%. I'd like to focus on the year 1965 for a moment. In 1965, an infamous paper was published now known as the Moynihan Report. The Moynihan Report was a 1965 report on poverty in Black homes in the United States written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the secretary for President Lyndon Johnson at the time. The details of this paper and its findings aren't entirely relevant, but what I'd like to focus on is its emphasis and concern over the rate of single mothers in the Black community at the time. See, in 1965, 25% of children were born out of wedlock, and this number, 25%, was so alarming and concerning at the time that it inspired a White House secretary to write this paper that attempted to delve deep into the dynamics of African American families and discover what was going so wrong. Today, that number is roughly 40% for all Americans, regardless of race. It really cannot be overstated how dramatically this phenomenon has increased. 25% was considered a catastrophe at the time, and now even white families are sitting well above that at around 30%. It isn't like this isn't a well-known fact either. While maybe back in the day of Moynihan, this subject was more a discussion for those in academia or politics, today this is a mainstream topic that is very well represented in pop culture, and frankly, has been for quite some time. Take any popular rapper today, and it's almost certain that you can find a reference to fatherless homes in their music.
No love for my daddy, cause the coward wasn't there.
Damn, I look just like my fucking dad.
Not only is this topic well known and understood in mainstream America, I think we've actually gone past the point of awareness and reached a point of indifference. Broken homes are so common that people are numb to how bad for society this is. It's brought up extremely casually or even not at all because it feels pointless to explicitly state. It seems like as a society we've given up on addressing this issue and are just waiting for it to run its course. So, we've established the problem exists and that it's incredibly common, but so what? Why do I think it's so destructive that I say it's the first step in fixing America? By every measurable statistic, children, mothers, and households are worse off without a father. An analysis published by Informa UK Limited examined 48 studies, most of which were done in the US, on single-parent homes since the 1940s, and found that 34 studies reported a statistically significant positive relation between single-parent families and crime. Some sources say that the incarceration rate is 3 times higher among those who grow up fatherless, and some even higher. 72% of juvenile murderers and 60% of rapists come from single-mother homes in 2004. In 1988, 70% of juveniles in state reform institutions grew up in a single or no-parent situation. Traditionally, in American culture, fathers are seen as the primary disciplinary force in the home, where a mother might put their child in line by threatening, "Don't make me tell your father," or "Wait till your father hears about this." By removing this from the home, not only are you removing that disciplinary force, but you're placing that burden on the mother, who, now single, has much more responsibility than she would have had if the father was there in the first place, leaving her overwhelmed. Thinking about these overwhelmed mothers reminds me of all those Father's Day ads praising single mothers as the mom who played both roles. In reality, one person cannot play both roles adequately for a child. It takes two to raise a family. Growing up fatherless is also correlated with negative academic performance. Children who have fathers that spend meaningful time with them are 43% more likely to earn mostly A's and 33% less likely than other children to repeat a grade, suggesting that fathers not only help their kids achieve their best, but prevent kids from performing their worst. In 1991, 15% of children living with a single mother and 11% of children living with a divorced mother had been excluded from school, compared to only 4.5% of children living with both biological parents. Children who grow up in single-parent homes on average complete 2 fewer years of school in their lifetime than those from two-parent homes. A study done across many countries in 2017 found that students not only performed worse in math when growing up fatherless, but also reported a lower internal locus of control. This means that young students who didn't have a father in their life feel like they have less influence over their outcomes, and they're more likely to feel like their circumstances and achievements are something out of their control. It makes sense why they might feel this way. If you can't even control or influence the relationship you have with your father, that feeling of helplessness over your family structure could leak into other aspects of your life. Finally, growing up in a single-parent home also negatively impacts the mental well-being of children and their mothers. According to Child Trends Databank, single parents in 2013 were twice as likely to be depressed as parents living in two-parent families. While 5% of all parents reported 2 or more symptoms related to depression, 11% of single parents reported 2 or more symptoms related to depression. Teens growing up without a father in the home are more likely to abuse drugs, attempt suicide, and have mental health problems. The National Center for Biotechnology Information cites the absence of a father as a risk factor for psychological distress and depression for both mothers and children, and increasing the level of stress in mothers due to the socioeconomic disadvantage that comes along with it. And that's another thing that's so awful about growing up fatherless. It's not just the lack of a father figure putting families at risk, it's that it has a compounding effect with other risk factors. For example, if growing up fatherless makes a child 10% more likely to drop out of high school, and growing up poor makes a child 10% more likely to drop out of high school, and 50% of fatherless kids are poor, then the dropout risk is only an extra 10% for half the fatherless kids. For the other half, it's an extra 21% because they have 2 risk factors that make it 10% more likely. Simply put, growing up in a single-parent home results in devastating consequences for families and for society at large. Listen to Barack Obama's iconic Father's Day speech on the matter. He delivered this speech almost 15 years ago, and yet still, today, the problem continues.
We know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime. They're 9 times more likely to drop out of school. 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teen parents because the father wasn't in the home. The foundations of our community and our country are weaker because of this.
So what do we do? What is the root cause of this epidemic, and how do we treat it? Firstly, I think it's crucial for us to adjust our laws in a way that doesn't take fathers away from their children unnecessarily. The prison industrial complex, specifically I think the war on drugs, has left so many children fatherless that even if you support criminalizing drug use, you must agree that the punishments don't fit the crime. Sticking someone in jail for 5 years for holding an ounce of weed under their bed, which is the minimum length sentence in some states like Florida, is absolutely doing more harm to society than good, even if you think personal use of marijuana should be illegal. According to the data given by the FBI, over 10 million arrests were made from 2011 to 2020 on the grounds of drug possession, and 45% of those arrests were marijuana. This is not only wasting an unreasonable amount of taxpayer dollars, but physically taking fathers away from their children and breaking up families, as the divorce rate for couples where one spouse is incarcerated is over 80%. Then consider that one's ability to earn money is compromised after having a criminal record, and you're seriously damaging a child's upbringing over mostly harmless drug charges unnecessarily. It's impossible to talk about the rise in fatherless homes without mentioning the welfare state. This is probably the most common scapegoat for this issue, especially for those on the right side of the political aisle. In 1935, FDR's New Deal established the Aid to Dependent Children program under the Social Security Act, which provided financial assistance to families whose fathers were unable to work, deceased, or absent. This program, however, was very limited at the time. States were not required to implement it, the amount paid to each family was not regulated, and the lack of civil rights at the time meant black families received very little of this assistance. Paradoxically, single mothers were also largely excluded from this program because they didn't meet the ADC requirement of being a suitable home. The ADC remained largely ineffective until the 1960s. In the 60s, the National Welfare Rights Organization, in tandem with the Civil Rights Movement, successfully pushed for the expansion of these benefits to black women, and it also began to include unemployed male parents with a work history. In 1968, the Supreme Court ruled in its decision of King v. Smith that mothers could not be excluded from benefits on the grounds that there was a male cohabitant. You see, up until then, mothers were not eligible recipients if they were in a relationship of any kind with a man who was not the children's father. In the case of Mrs. Sylvester Smith, she had 3 children with a deceased man and 1 with an absent man, making her ADFC eligible, until it was discovered that she was engaged in sexual relations with a new man who is not the father of the 4th child. The state of Alabama withheld her aid on the grounds that the man was a cohabitant, which the Supreme Court ruled was unconstitutional. In the eyes of some, this was the first step in enabling single motherhood and children out of wedlock, as it meant women were less incentivized to stay with the father of their children. In addition, the ADFC program did not include the income of stepfathers into consideration until 1981, hypothetically incentivizing women to not stay with their children's father even more. This sentiment is well explained with a quote from Shoshana Grossberg-Schechtman's Marriage and the Economy. Quote, "The AFDC program tended to treat households with a cohabiting male who was not the natural father of the children much more leniently than those with a resident spouse or father of the children. This feature created a clear disincentive for marriage and also a clear incentive for divorce, because women who married faced the reduction or loss of their AFDC benefits." Since the 1980s, government assistance in the US has declined, and in the late 90s, the AFDC was replaced by the much more restrictive Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. This makes the welfare state hypothesis difficult to examine because, while it is true that the initial rise in fatherless homes began in the 1960s when welfare capabilities were greatly expanded, the rise of fatherless homes continued even once welfare was cut back in the 80s and 90s. Personally, I agree that the introduction of a stronger social safety net in the 60s is a contributing factor to the epidemic of single motherhood, but I don't believe it is the most significant one as some make it out to be. I would say it's undeniable that many people use welfare programs, including those targeted to help single mothers, to their advantage. There is a cultural attitude towards men held by the lowest of the low-quality women that sees them as nothing but a dollar sign to be exploited. This toxic mindset is on full display in athlete and entertainer circles, who are constantly on guard for women looking to have their baby and steal their money. Look no further than everyone's favorite Insta-thottie, Brittany Renner.
In my experience, the worst people to deal with are the athletes. None of them use condoms, really. So if y'all really want to try to come up off a check off a man, I mean, you could just fuck an athlete. They're really done.
Or the infamous Drake hot sauce story. Eliminating or reducing alimony, child support requirements, or social programs may decrease the amount of women trying to leech money off a man or the government, but at what cost? The vast majority of single mothers never aspire to be one. They end up that way through negligence, pure chance, or unfortunate circumstance, none of which can be fixed through altering financial incentive structures. Plus, even if it were the case that most single mothers are exploiting the system, is that worth leaving the children in these homes with even less money? I don't think so. I think the introduction of strong financial support for single mothers partially enabled the cultural shifts that led to the rise in fatherless homes, but I don't think scaling back that infrastructure is what reminds America of the sacredness of the nuclear family. I don't think the main culprit in the rise of fatherless homes is something that can be pinpointed to a specific policy. Rather, it's a social problem. Like I said, most women who become single mothers don't plan on becoming single mothers. So how does one unintentionally become a single mother? It's not a trick question. The answer is unprotected sex. Engaging in reproductive sex without recognizing the reproductive aspect. The sexual revolution has somehow separated the act of sex from the consequences of sex, convincing an entire generation that the law of cause and effect does not apply to them. But how did that even come about? Enter women's employment. As women became more capable to earn their own living, they became more sensitive to other societal norms that felt restricting. I think people underestimate how much of a seismic shift women's economic independence was. Sure, women technically have been occupying professions for thousands of years, but they were limited to what men allowed them to do. Prostitutes, nurses, nuns, teachers, and performers. Women were essentially restricted to child and healthcare, entertainment, and the church. Women had such a lack of professional autonomy that during the Renaissance era, women were not allowed to perform in theaters, meaning that cross-dressing men played all of Shakespeare's iconic female roles. Women being allowed to work, and more importantly, allowed to make an independent living, was a massive cultural shift. Remember what I said earlier about single-parent homes being denied welfare because they were deemed unsuitable for children? Without this shift in the workplace, there would have been no sexual revolution, and it is the disaster of the sexual revolution that is at the heart of all this. The defining moments of the sexual revolution all came in the 1960s, and the one I want to focus on is oral contraception, or the pill. I think hormonal contraception presents a danger that physical contraception like a condom doesn't. Physical contraception forces the users to acknowledge the risk of sex. It's a decision the user has to consciously make, telling themselves, I'm using this because engaging in sex comes with the risk of STDs and pregnancy. The user is forced to consciously accept the potential consequences of sex every time they have it. With hormonal birth control, there is no physical reminder of the consequences of sex. You may think this is a reach, but how else could you explain the rise in births out of wedlock? The only explanation for why there are more people unintentionally making babies is that people are failing to assess the long-term consequences of their actions. This is what the sexual revolution has done. It has tricked people into believing that sex isn't a big deal, but it is. And if you look at the rate of births outside of wedlock, it's very clear to see why. While women's financial independence helped create the fatherless crisis because it enabled a sexual revolution, it also has a role to play in itself. Women gaining financial independence has thrown the modern dating market way off because women want to earn more, but not more than men. At least, that's what the data shows. Despite women earning the majority of college degrees for over 30 years now, and the adjusted pay gap being reduced to only 5%, women earn more than their husband in only about 30% of marriages, which means women are not choosing men who earn less than them. But even in the case they do, these marriages often find the disparity to be a source of tension. Both women and men are more likely to over-report the husband's income and under-report the wife's income when she is the breadwinner. These marriages are also significantly more likely to end in divorce, up to 50% in some estimates, and are more likely to engage in infidelity. In fact, as husbands become more financially dependent on their wife, both the husband and the wife are more likely to cheat. All this talk about women's financial independence provides context for the final reason why fatherlessness has risen: the marriage rate. Less people are getting married, those who are get married later in life, and with the divorce rate as high as it is, they aren't as likely to last as in the past. Because the sexual revolution has successfully decoupled family creation from sex, pushing marriage to later in life or getting rid of it entirely doesn't mean less kids, it just means less kids into a stable home. Back in the day when women got pregnant outside of marriage, it was a common practice to get married as quickly as possible in what was called a shotgun wedding. Since the 1960s, which, in case you forgot, is the time period where fatherless homes started rising, shotgun marriages have gradually disappeared. And this isn't just because of better forms of birth control. This is because people are less willing to get married at all, let alone at a moment's notice. So if women's economic and sexual liberation is responsible for the decrease in marriage and increase in single mothers, what do we do? Erase decades of civil rights progress, confine women to the home, and leave them with no option but to be completely dependent on their husbands? I think the best solution is somewhere in between. There definitely needs to be a cultural shift towards modesty and sexual responsibility, but unfortunately, I don't see that coming back anytime soon. What we can do is strengthen the economy and reform labor regulations. I don't think women should be barred from having their own career or face discrimination in the workplace. Instead, adjust the economic landscape so that women wouldn't need or want to work in the first place. An unintended effect of women entering the workplace is wage stagnation. The supply of domestic labor essentially doubled since the 1960s, but the demand hasn't increased much, meaning more productivity for businesses at the same price. This is why average families in the 60s were able to live comfortably with a stay-at-home mom, but nowadays most families have both parents working and are living paycheck to paycheck. And is this shape starting to look familiar? Fatherless homes, wage growth, women's employment, female breadwinners, divorce rates, they all rose sharply in the 60s and 70s, typically kept growing at a slower rate in the 80s and 90s, and have remained constant since the turn of the century. These issues are all connected, and that's partially why this series is difficult to organize, because I'm trying to divide these problems into their appropriate sectors, but nothing exists in a vacuum. Let's try to wrap this up as neatly as possible. Since the 1960s, we've seen an enormous rise in fatherless homes, which has brought devastating consequences to our society. If we are to fix America, the change needs to start in the home. I believe decriminalizing drugs for personal use will allow more fathers to escape the prison industrial complex and be present and attentive for their precious children. I believe some reconsideration may be in order for our current welfare and alimony laws, and we should find a way to prevent women from manipulating the system without hurting the majority of women who need this assistance. And finally, I believe by introducing more protective labor regulations and embracing sexual modesty, we can enable men and women to fulfill their traditional gender roles, which are ingrained in our very biology, without having to strip women of the ability to support themselves financially if they must, leading to less divorce, more marriage, and less births out of wedlock. This issue is of the utmost importance. If you agree with my analysis, please share this with anyone who will listen, and if you don't, let your voice be heard. We must exchange ideas and repair the American family. The future of our children and our country depend on it.